Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to Profiling Evil Live. It is great to be with you. Happy Valentine's Day. And to those of you who have been waiting, thanks for jumping on. Heck, I don't know how many might show up tonight, but it's kind of interesting. This morning I woke up and I thought, I got to tell Betty's story today. And the craziest thing just happened. I just received a phone call from Australia. The man that we're going to be talking about tonight, who believes his father killed Betty Shanks, just called to say that he had noticed that we had put this on and was having a rough day because today is his now deceased wife's birthday. And he was struggling, and he was so grateful that there was something going on about Betty's murder today. So maybe that's why, who knows? But to all of you, thanks for being here. This could be a long old marathon tonight. And like I said in my note, my wife has COVID. So I just finished eating a cupcake. I'm sitting by myself, and we're going to do this show. And I'm going to just get going on this thing. And my buddy Ken is now here in the room. He actually just called in, so I'm going to bring him in a minute. But I want to start off with a little intro to what we're going to be talking about tonight. And to everybody, hey, thanks so much for being here. Let's get started with this. 70 years ago, 22-year-old Betty Shanks was brutally murdered while walking the quiet streets of her Queensland, Australia neighborhood. Her death remained unsolved until now, as a compelling witness comes forward with a remarkable story that could finally bring closure to this murder case and give the psychology student the justice that she deserves.
The murder of 22-year-old Betty Shanks is known as the crime that stole Brisbane's innocence. 70 years on, the case remains unsolved. At the time, police identified the man in the brown suit as their primary suspect. This map captures eyewitness testimony regarding this man and presents two potential suspects. On the evening of Friday, the 19th of September 1952, Betty Shanks was attending a night lecture at Brisbane Commercial High School. When classes finished, her lecturer dropped her off at tram stop 19 so she could catch the tram home. Betty got off the tram at the Grange tram terminus, where she was last seen alive. She never made it to her home on Montpellier Street. While several neighbours reported hearing Betty's screams, no one chose to investigate. The following morning, Betty's body, brutally beaten, was found in the backyard of a home on Carberry Street. What we know is that Betty, along with a handful of other commuters, arrived at the terminus at exactly 9:32 p.m. While all other passengers dispersed, there are 6 to 8 minutes where Betty's movements cannot be accounted for. Several witnesses reported seeing a man in a brown suit loitering around the terminus for approximately an hour before Betty's tram arrived. He was pacing up and down the platform restlessly, even peering into a car as if looking for someone. One witness, Clarence Hovelroud, remembered speaking to him. At the time, Detective Senior Sergeant Norm Bauer theorised of 2 possible scenarios regarding Betty's attack. Either Betty was met at or followed from the Grange tram terminus, or someone was lying in wait for her under the cover of the Bohinia trees on Thomas Street. Upon revisiting the case, 2 men have emerged as potential suspects, fitting the profiles painted by Detective Bauer. The first suspect is Eric. Eric and his family lived in Bowen Hills. Allegedly, Eric knew Betty as she had hired him to do some carpentry work on her parents' house. Eric's daughter claims that on the night of the murder, Her father drove her and her brother to Wilston State School, parking their car alongside the sports field on Inglis Street under a large tree. She remembers sitting in the car for a very long time, waiting for her father to return. She also remembers seeing her father acting suspiciously in the backyard when they returned home, and having to clean blood from his shoes the next day. It is hypothesized that Eric parked a block from Betty's street, crossed the school oval, and walked up to wait for Betty's tram at the terminus, later making his way down Thomas Street and settling in the shadows of the Bohinia trees. The second suspect is Joe. On Friday nights, Joe would tell his family he was going fishing, but would instead go drinking at the Kedron Park Hotel. In a statement provided by Joe's son, Ken, it is alleged that Joe drove and parked near the Grange tram terminus on the night of Betty's murder. Ken believes his father had intended to intercept his mother on her way to the home of a man whom he believed she was having an affair with. Ken asserts, in what he suspects was an intoxicated state, Joe spotted Betty, who had an incredible likeness to his wife, then followed her down Thomas Street and attacked her in a jealous rage. It is Ken's belief that Betty's death was a tragic case of mistaken identity. It was suggested that after attacking the woman he thought to be his wife, Joe fled the scene to nearby Bancroft Park, where he tried unsuccessfully to wash off all the evidence of Betty's violent death. This is before allegedly making his way to the taxi rank. A witness at the time, a taxi driver, reported picking up a man covered in blood at a taxi rank on Ashgrove Avenue. The driver was reportedly wary of the passenger, not only for his bloody appearance, but for the roundabout path he directed him to drive. In the end, the driver was instructed to drop the passenger at the Red Hill Post Office after snaking through the surrounding streets of Ashgrove, Newmarket, and Red Hill. Eric and Joe's involvement in the death of Betty Shanks is pure speculation, and offer two of a countless pool of theories that have been presented over the decades. So, while the identity of the man in the brown suit remains a mystery, understanding the possible paths of victim and predator may be the key to unlocking this 70-year mystery. Needless to say, amateur historians, cold case investigators, and armchair experts alike will continue to be drawn in by Betty and her story until justice is served.
Well, there you go. So we're going to be talking about the murder of Betty Shanks. And I had Ken on for a few minutes. He's dialing in from Australia. Again, this is a man who's in his 80s now, and I think he had some trouble. He dropped off. So hopefully we'll get him back. I'm going to introduce you to Ken as the night goes on through video that I captured just a few months ago. But I want to just shout out to all of you that are here in the room. Thank you for coming on. I know it's Valentine's night. You probably would prefer to be out doing something, but if you're like me and circumstances were different and you were at home, I thought, wow, let's just have some fun and talk about this. And I get emails all the time saying, why don't you do a long live where we can just spend some time and chat? And I thought, okay, tonight's the night. So we'll see if people come on, and we'll see if we can do something with this case. In fact, I've got Ken calling me right here. I'm going to just take this really quick and see. Hello, Ken. Ken? Oh, and he's disconnected again. So we're going to jump back into this thing. We're going to do sections of video. We're going to stop. I'm going to be watching your questions. Sean Marie, this happened in 1952, September 19th. It was 70 years when we released the Who Killed Betty Mapping Evil Season 2 series that won the international awards last year. And we had a deal with Channel 9 News in Australia that we were going to hold off till now to release the personal video that I took of the son of the man that I believe probably killed Betty Shanks. And so we're going to talk about this case in a little detail. I'll play a little bit of a teaser from the podcast, and just encourage you all to go back to Mapping Evil Season 2, Killing Betty. But for now, we're going to talk about the case. We're going to explore the case. And then Ken and I are going to drive around Brisbane. We're going to walk where Betty walked, and we're going to stand where Betty died. And something really cool happens at the location where Betty died. So I want to just tell you, cliffhanger, hang on for that when it comes out. So I'll be watching your comments, and we'll just chat as this thing goes on. Let's jump back into it. Betty would actually be 94 years old if she were alive today. She could have had a wonderful life filled with a career, friends, loved ones, perhaps a spouse, and probably children. Instead, she was murdered on a neighborhood street under the cover of the Bohemia trees. This episode of Profiling Evil is going to explore the murder of Betty Shanks and my investigation into her untimely death. For years, many people centered their focus on a man named Eric Starry, mostly because of the work of Australian author Ted Dews. Now, Dews believes the story told by Eric Starry's daughter, based on her memories of being left in a dark car by her father for a period of time just within blocks of where Betty was murdered. Starry's description and Ted's work are compelling. You know, I've personally chatted with Ted at length about his theories. I really appreciate his experiences. I appreciate his friendship. And while Ted's theories may be accurate, I can't discount my own experience in looking into this case. And to do this, we're going to need to travel back in time, just before the coronavirus pandemic shut down the world. A few months before the pandemic, I was in Australia on business, and while there, I had the opportunity to be interviewed by ABC. That's the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. I was being interviewed regarding some unsolved crimes in Australia. Now, the broadcaster surprised me with a question regarding the coldest case in Queensland, the murder of Betty Shanks. Well, I'd never even heard of Betty Shanks or her murder, but I responded confidently that the public can find hope in these cold cases, even ones that are nearly 70 years old. Hope that they can be solved. And I remember commenting that time isn't necessarily the enemy in cold cases anymore. I concluded my on-screen comments by suggesting that over time, some people get the courage to step forward and talk about things they couldn't share at an earlier time in their lives. They might have been young and frightened. They could have been in a relationship where they were fearful that the person that they were informing against would retaliate in some way. Well, the interview seemed to end on a positive note, and I raced to the airport before saying my goodbyes and flying back to the United States. Well, I'll never forget the rush of emotion I experienced as I exited the plane in Los Angeles and began looking and listening to the voicemail messages on my phone. These were messages that had accumulated over that 14-hour flight. The first message, it came from a man with an Australian accent who identified himself merely as Ken. He asked me to return his call, and then he simply said, "My father killed Betty Shanks." Well, over the months that followed, I dug deeper and deeper into his claim, reviewing many of the people who were considered at one time or another to be a person of interest. Each of them had compelling parts and pieces to their stories and their theories. But after hearing Ken's declaration, I immediately turned him over to the Queensland Police Service for follow-up. There was something that really intrigued me, genuinely intrigued me about Ken. I continued to look at each person of interest in the Shanks case, including exploring the eyewitness accounts, the physical and forensic evidence, circumstantial evidence, and of course, behavioral evidence, everything associated with that murder. And as I looked at each one, I kept gravitating back to Ken's statement, my father killed Betty Shanks. Well, it was equally compelling to Starry's daughter claim that her father had killed Betty. But there were other possibilities that I personally needed to exclude. For instance, the suggestion out there that a motorcycle police officer hit Betty as she was crossing the street that fateful night. The story suggested that the officer threw her body over the fence and into the yard where she was later discovered. Now, this scenario focused on a boot print, an impression that was discovered on Betty's forehead. Now, some people theorized that the imprint resembled the pattern found on a police motor officer's boots. As a former motor officer, I was intrigued, but not for long. I quickly discounted it as a red herring. Now, other true crime enthusiasts disagreed with the police officer theory, but they felt the boot pattern resembled that of an army soldier. They backed up their assessment with evidence of a large contingency of soldiers who had been training in the area at the time of the murder. Nonetheless, after examining what was publicly available, I eliminated both scenarios as possibilities. I then focused on a theory that pointed this finger of death at a local physician. Now, there were rumors that Betty and a local physician were having an affair. In reality, there wasn't anything that supported that claim that I could find. Now, obviously, there had been some contact between the two from what I read, but I likened it unto the bizarre red herrings that we see spin out of control in our current day whodunits. The doctor in question, he committed suicide just a few days after Betty's death, and that added fuel to the speculation. Later investigations proved that the doctor's business was failing, though. He was in financial trouble. And many people believed that he became so depressed about the situation that he took his own life. It was because of the finances and the failures, not an affair with Betty Shanks, or not because he committed a murder. I just don't believe it. And I wonder if he ever really knew who Betty was outside of a possible doctor's visit. And then there was the theory about the locksmith with whom some believed Betty was having an affair with. The locksmith. Now, folks, I want to pause right here for a second because part of what I want tonight is a response from you, and I want to see you weighing in the chat about this theory around Eric Starry. And this is the whole basis of Ted Due's book, I Know Who Killed Betty Shanks. And Ted is convinced that Starry is the killer. I want you to listen to my reasoning. It's going to take about 5 minutes of discussion here. And then we're going to pause because I want to see what your thoughts are in that regard. Let's jump back in. 42-year-old married father, a man with a family. Now, years later, his daughter came forward with a story that her father killed Betty. She said that she witnessed her father in the car and that he left her inside that car near the murder scene. She said she was left in the car while her father allegedly committed the crime, and she even remembers him burning bloody clothes. Now, she admits that she didn't witness the homicide, but she remembers him, again, burning the clothes that night. The story goes on that the locksmith, a man named Eric Starry, had developed a relationship with Betty after doing some work on the Shank home. Again, it was really compelling information. The Starry theory was molded into a book titled I Know Who Killed Betty Shanks by Ted Due. I had the opportunity and privilege of interviewing Due, and I have a great deal of respect for him. His storyline may be absolutely correct, but I want to make sure you understand I'm certainly not challenging his research or his interviews. But that said, the investigator inside of me isn't satisfied with it. I am in no way suggesting Due's missed the mark, but I am not convinced nonetheless. Now, that said, the story that I'm going to share with Ken didn't always sit comfortably with me either. Here's where I'm waffling. The more I learn about Betty Shanks, the less convinced I am of Starry's involvement in her murder. And here's why. It all boils down to victimology, or the study of who Betty Shanks was. While the Starry theory may one day prove to be accurate, I think it's really important that we carefully weigh the newest information from, in my opinion, an equally credible source, Ken, the son who believes his father murdered Betty Shanks. But first, let's explore this topic of victimology, or the study of the victim, as I come about why I'm a little uncomfortable with this thing. In the Sherlock Holmes book, The Sign of Four, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle penned the words, quote, "When you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth," close quote. Think about that. The goal of any investigation is to solve the mystery, to answer questions, and to reveal truth. Now, Ken's new evidence suggested that there's a new suspect that needs to be considered, and because of that, it's an investigator's responsibility to do so. Now, I know that Ken visited with the Queensland police. I also know there's a few things that I can't talk about that Karen shared with me about that interaction and about what they have to say about evidence, whether it's in storage or not, lost or recovered or whatever. But if we ignore new evidence, we fall victim of our own arrogance, and we might spend a whole bunch of time twisting facts to meet our theories. Folks, we got to evaluate information in hopes that it might help us understand what happened to Betty Shanks. Examining the victim's background and lifestyle will help us unravel and eliminate some misguided leads. Understanding who the victim is, Betty, and perhaps why she became a victim can also guide the investigation toward who a probable suspect might be, rather than constantly going back and looking at the 6 or more possible suspects in this case. The FBI's crime classification manual teaches us that victimology is a beneficial tool for classifying and solving violent crimes. It's crucial, and through it, investigators uncover why particular victims are targeted. Now, these exercises can also lead the investigator to the offender's motive and ultimately the offender themselves. Statistically, the more violent and complex the crime, the more valuable the victimology study is. Victimologies include evaluating the victim's physical characteristics, their work and leisure activities, religious affiliations, and the compliance to religious standards. Now, victimology asks what happened in this crime series. Where did the crime occur? What were the unfolding stages of the crime? Questions like these can lead investigators toward a clearer understanding of the victim selection process and crime motivation. And it can also help us better understand why the crime occurred in the location that it happened. So I'd encourage you to go back and watch my videos in the Academy series, because there I explore many of these same principles that we're briefly touching on here. You can find those educational videos on our content page, and I hope that you enjoyed this little sidebar lesson on victimology. Personally, I think it's really important in order to understand the concerns that I have with the idea that Eric Starry and Betty Shanks were having an affair. So in a nutshell, here's why I'm having such a difficult time reconciling this idea that a 42-year-old blue-collar worker was having an intimate relationship with a woman who's described as vibrant, intelligent, a 22-year-old college student who was actively being recruited by the federal government for a top secret position. Can you see her jumping in with a 42-year-old married guy with kids who's having an affair and sneaking around? I'm just having trouble with it. Now, further, Betty appeared to be finding success in many aspects of her life. I mean, she had a robust circle of friends and schoolmates. She seemed to live in a happy and stable home, which was evidenced by her continued residency at home and, frankly, her willingness to share a recent lottery winning that she had with her family. So, folks, I want to stop right here for a minute before I add a little more context to this. And I want to just look in the chat and see what your thoughts are. I want to recap what I think is very important. Again, the theory is that Eric Starry, this 42-year-old locksmith who once did work on the Shanks home, somehow got involved with Betty Shanks and they were having an affair. And when things didn't go right, he committed this homicide. And it was a brutal, brutal homicide. Now, let me give you a little more suspectology. Starry, 42 years old, working a blue collar job. The guy's got a wife and children. He's somehow masterminding this ability to get out and have, if it's all true, a secret affair with this young 22-year-old woman who seems to have the tiger by the tail and is attacking life. Look, being recruited by the Australian federal government for a top secret position, actively going to college and getting a circle of friends. And I just want to know what you think about this. And I'm going to stop and read a couple of your comments here, and we're gonna talk. A question popped up by Jules, and that is, could Betty have been a whistleblower or knew something? Absolutely. I mean, those are all possibilities, but again, it's more about the probabilities. And I think as I lay out more of my thought process, it might help you focus in. I don't know. Let's see. Becca says, if Starry's the perp, how could he take his kids with him and leave them in the car? Yeah, so that's kind of interesting. If you're purposely going to commit a homicide, are you really going to have your kids in the car? Maybe he had to. I mean, in the book, Starry's children talk about the fact that he had taken them before when he was going drinking or other things and left them in the car. So I guess it's possible. Now, the interesting thing is, and this is probably a good time to talk about it, we'll just pull up a little map here and talk about it. But parking the car a couple of blocks away and doing that when the idea is that he would come in contact with her at the tram terminus, and that's a terminal train station, is interesting. Janine R 33. Well, from the details you gave, I don't think it's likely he was having an affair with her. Why would she tangle herself up with a married man with kids? In my opinion, highly unlikely. So that's kind of the gut thing that I was having trouble with early on. And it took me a while to find some additional reports that I'm going to share in just a moment. But let's see what Ruth has to say here. It's hard to believe she's having an affair with anyone. She seems like she has more going for her. Seems like maybe someone wanted to have an affair and got turned down by Betty. That's a really interesting thing. So let's just take a moment and let's look at the area where Betty was murdered. In fact, I think we'll come back to that in a minute because I want to cover some other groundwork before. So now, folks, keep in mind the things that we've been talking about. And again, I mean absolutely no disrespect. I just disagree with Ted Dews and his direction that he was taking. But I'll tell you what, listening to him talk through his reasoning and his evidence is incredibly compelling. I just can't get past the behavior. And that's what you do as a profiler, is you look at behavior. And that's really troubling to me, that this 42-year-old guy working a blue-collar job, have I said it enough times, with a wife and kids sneaking around, would be appealing to a 22-year-old girl who seems to have the world going and working together. Let's jump back in, because I think you're going to be really interested with what comes out in the autopsy, because then I want to see you weighing in, folks, and I want to know what you think after you see and hear a little more of the facts. On the other hand, you've got Starry, twice her age. He had a wife and children. And to successfully carry on an affair, he's got to be secretive and nimble. And by all accounts, Starry was living on a tight budget as he worked his blue-collar jobs. So here's the bottom line for me, and the thing that's making me say this dog don't hunt. And that is, at the risk of sounding judgmental, I find it really hard to believe that this married man would sneak out and cheat on his wife with a woman that he wasn't intimate with. Now, how on earth do I know that? I don't know that I do, but I've got a little bit of evidence that I want to present to you. But I want to ask this question first to all of you, and I really do want you to weigh in, does it make sense to you that this married guy would have any interest in a relationship with someone that he can just talk with? I want to know what you think here, and I'm going to watch for some comments as we pop in, because what's coming up, I think, is, for me, the smoking gun to why this just didn't happen. Now, in most cases, affairs are all about excitement, conquest, and intimacy. And I bring all this up because we can say with a level of confidence that Eric Starry and Betty Shanks were not sexually active. Now, I'm basing this theory on Betty's autopsy report that revealed that the 22-year-old woman was still a virgin. So let's stop right there. Now, does that change anything for you? Because now what we have are behavioral pieces of evidence, but now we have solid forensic evidence. And again, there could be a intimate relationship without going to the extent of intercourse. But again, do you see a man who's sneaking around trying to do this being satisfied with a visit in the park, especially if he's shared that this was a torrid affair? Let's jump back in. Now, this doesn't mean that the relationship may not have existed physically or emotionally. In other words, Starry may have fantasized about a relationship with Betty. Heck, he may have even boasted to others that the two were involved. But I find it really hard to believe, nonetheless, that this guy was having an affair with her. Now, on a darker note, Starry's possible fantasies might have led him to be stalking and perhaps even murdering the young woman. So, in fairness to Ted's research, the Starry line of thinking is compelling, but I don't believe Eric Starry killed Betty Shanks. Now, I'm not discounting what Starry's daughter has said either. This woman truly believes the story she shared, and it's part of her reality and her memories. In her mind, her father killed Betty Shanks, and it's as real to her as if it happened yesterday. So with that said, isn't it fair that we also give Ken's theory the same balanced consideration? Hey, I want to also mention I spoke with another author, a former reporter on the Betty Shanks case named Ken Blanche. Blanche wrote the book Who Killed Betty Shanks. Well, hey, folks, I hope you're enjoying this video on the murder of Betty Shanks. And I extend the same gratitude to Mr. Blanche to talk with a man who believes his father killed the young woman. I appreciate their efforts to solve the Betty Shanks murder. Now, take a moment and enter your comments down below about whether you think Betty was having... Well, man, I clearly missed the editing there, so I'm going to skip ahead just a moment. Thanks for your patience with me. Now, Betty had just left a lecture she was attending, and she was starting her 8-kilometer journey home. Now, please go over and visit the Betty Shanks story map. I'm showing it on the screen here in order to get more detail. And make sure you're listening to Season 2 of Mapping Evil with Mike King, Killing Betty. There, you're going to hear the entire story in detail. In fact, I want to just pause for a second and take a sample from Mapping Evil with Mike King's Season 2, Killing Betty. Let's listen.
This podcast contains detailed descriptions of violence and murder and is intended for a mature audience. Listener discretion is advised.
19th of September 1952. There's been a shocking sex murder at Wilston. 400 police are now involved in a major murder manhunt.
This is season 2 of Mapping Evil with Mike King.
This was this beautiful, low-risk woman murdered and left on the side of a road, thrown over a fence and into a backyard.
When I saw the body, I realised just how horrible the whole thing was. She'd been kicked or bashed so hard on the side of the face that one of her teeth had dislodged from its socket, emerged through the cheek on the other side of her face and landed on the grass.
I'm Tori Shepherd, journalist and true crime enthusiast. And in this podcast series, Murdering Betty, we delve deep into Queensland's most gruesome and longest-running cold case.
It would appear, from the partial undressing of the body and from the position in which the body had been placed, that the objective of her assailant was to make a sexual attack, but that he had been thwarted in some way.
In this 4-part series, we take you on a suspenseful quest. Who could have committed such a spine-chilling, brutal killing on that fateful Brisbane night?
My dad killed Betty Shanks.
This predator couldn't have come out of this unscathed. He likely would have blood all over him. There's evidence like blood transfers on the top rail of the fence that support this theory.
We'll take you to the crime scene and reveal that beneath one of Australia's most shocking murder mysteries lies a vital, geographic footprint.
There are 3 primary sites that we're going to look at as we talk about crime scenes. So if you're asking yourself if the geography really matters, I think absolutely.
There have been so many theories and suspects over the years. The doctor who committed suicide 2 days after Betty's death, the soldier on the motorbike, the handyman that was supposedly having an affair with Betty. And on that night, a taxi driver named Murray Templeton picked up what he described as a well-built, tallish man near the Newmarket Hall.
The first thing I noticed was that he had blood on his clothes and face. It gave me the impression that he wanted to get away from the locality as soon as possible, giving me the directions as he got in.
And then there's the mysterious man in a brown suit who was seen loitering at the tram terminus where Betty was last seen.
It was the man in the brown suit who very likely killed Betty Shanks.
And our world-renowned criminal profiler extraordinaire, Mike King, has uncovered a new lead in one of Australia's coldest cases.
I've been examining the Betty Shanks case since 2019, and the most peculiar thing happened. I was contacted by someone willing to share relevant information about this murder.
Joe murdered Betty Shanks, and I raced into my wife, and I said he did kill her, there's no other answer.
It's been 70 years. Do we finally have an answer to who killed Betty Shanks? Coming to you soon, Murdering Betty, the true crime podcast series Mapping Evil with Mike King.
Now, I don't want to discourage you from listening to the podcast, so I'm going to carry on as though you know parts of this story. And you can go back and watch that at any time. But on the night that Betty was killed, she and a few other students accepted a ride from their college professor. They were all in a downtown Brisbane, Australia school attending a lecture. Now, the professor dropped Betty off at tram stop number 19, just north of Brisbane. Betty jumped on a train and she started her westbound journey into the Grange. Now let's pause for just a moment and listen as Ken and I discuss tram stop number 19, now 70 plus years later.
It was a girls' high school, actually, where they used to have lectures down at the end of George Street. At night time, they used it as school during the day. And at night time, it was they'd done lectures and apprentices and all that sort of thing. Okay. There's actually a bus stop there now, and the seats at the bus stop, the structure of the bus stop is on exactly the same place as where the tram stop was. Exactly the same place. I'll actually show you the bus stop, which is exactly similar where the tram stop was, only it was an old wooden structure at the time. Covered seats, and the structure is still almost identical, only it's a metal sort of a structure now. It used to be a timber structure. That's where she got off the tram. That's where she caught the tram.
This small bus stop right here.
That there. Yeah, that's where the lecturer dropped her off. And this is the exact point where the lecturer dropped Betty off. The fact that he had other passengers, and the time he could allocate to each one, I guess, was the reason he did drop her off here and didn't take her directly home. She actually caught the tram at this very site on that particular night. I actually was in contact with the daughter of one of those passengers the other day, which is a very strange incident. I was talking to this lady, and she said her mother was on that tram.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
There's another thing. On the Friday nights, Joe's reason for not being in the house for the entire night was that he'd done the fishing trip on the boat he was associated with, the Miramar and the Brisbane River. But he only done the fishing trip 1 in 3. The other 2, he was out with his girlfriends, and he'd go to a dance called Cloudland, another dance at the Blind Institute of South Brisbane. On those particular Friday nights, he always drank at a hotel about a kilometre down the road there, called the Kedron Park Hotel, and as it was stated, there was a smell of alcohol on Joe that particular night. Hilverrout, I think, may have stated that, and that led me totally to believe he still went to that hotel. He left his home, about 4 p.m. He'd go to the hotel, visit on the nights he didn't do he was an engineer on the fishing boat. Well, when he went to the dances, he'd go to the hotel just around the corner up there and then go to the dance. But this particular Friday night...
Well, after Betty boarded that westbound train for the Grange, she sat alone in the car by all accounts. It was an unusually quiet Friday night, and as the train pulled into the terminus, she noted that it was about 9:32. In fact, it was recorded at 9:32 that it arrived. When Betty left the train, she ran into a female acquaintance. They spoke briefly for and then said their goodbyes. Now, a witness later reported seeing Betty and the friend chatting as Betty said goodbye and started her southward journey toward her home, walking down the hill off of Thomas Street. Now, I want to stop there for just a minute and look at a map. I want to also clarify something. You're going to hear Ken say Joe throughout this entire show. He's never called his father. He did say once he's my dad, but he never called him dad, never called him father. It was such an abusive childhood. So he always refers to the suspect in his mind as Joe, and that's his father. Now, I thought you might be interested in looking just at a little 3D map that I have here of the area. So this is where the Grange terminus or the terminal would have stopped. And the interesting thing is as that train came down the road, what Ken will describe in a moment, you can see there's a little bit of a dip down the train track road here, which now the train's gone and the road is obviously the most prominent thing. But the trains would usually stop here and then up here at the terminal. And then there was only a single track here. So they would have to take turns passing through that little channel down through the bottom and coming up. And then, of course, when we get back to where all of this happened, when I come back onto the screen, you're going to see a black and white image from when this crime occurred. It's looking from Betty's house, which is right here, up the road toward the tram terminal when we're looking at that black and white image. So just kind of keep that in mind. But the train would have come to a stop somewhere around here, and Betty would have gotten off the train and then come down the street and walked in hopes of heading straight down the road, down into this gully and all the way to her home, which again is at the top of the street on Montpelier right here. This is called Thomas Street right here. And Ken and I have walked all through that area. Now, when Derry's daughter said that she was in the car with her father, she said her father parked the car somewhere over here in this area. And I hope that's coming out clear on the screen as you look at it. Betty was murdered in this at this residence right here. And actually her body was dumped on this side of the residence, just inside the fence. So that means that Starry would have parked his car there, skulked his way across the street and here. Now, if his plan was to murder her and he was in hiding, that makes pretty good sense. Where you're going to learn as Ken talks tonight that his father was hiding under an old wooden staircase right here, watching for what he believed was his wife cheating on him. And he believed that she was cheating with a man who lived in this home right here, the train terminal stopping right here. And so this all becomes geographically really important. Again, the man that she believed, he believed his mother was having an affair with, Ken's mother, was the man that he believed she was having the affair with lived right here. The train would stop here. Betty got off of the train right here, and Ken believes this is a case of mistaken identity. But let's jump back into the video. You know, she'd walked that route 1,000 times before, and she always felt safe. I wonder if she felt safe on that night. Let's listen as Ken describes the tram line and the area of the Grange.
Like on that Sunday morning after the murder, Joe emphatically tried to make us believe that she got off the tram where the two tracks became one. He was very theatrical, and I may have described him before. He was very theatrical in his movements, trying to convince us that Betty Shanks did not get off at the terminus. And I could tell he was lying. I lived in his brain. Yeah, straight through here. I think...
how different? Or it's 70 years later. How different?
It is quite a bit different. You know, those islands, they were just this straight dual tram tracks were going out here. You get to the top of a rise, and this could be it here. You could see that the real terminus in the distance. I'll just see whether this is the rise. And a tram would wait here if there was one at the terminus. If there was a terminus, they'd have to wait till the other one left to go down to the single track itself. And you could see in the distance where the other tram was waiting. They could see each other. And this is at the Grange tram terminus. The witness at the coroner's inquiry, she was here. The car would have been parked right at this very spot. Joe approached her from that side of the road. She had 3 children in the car. Joe's family was a wife and 3 children. He wasn't leaving a stone unturned. He had to check that car out. And he terrified Eve Ansel. I spoke to Eve Ansel. She was actually a neighbour of mine. She lived about 50 metres from her house. But when I traced her regarding this, she told me how terrified she was regarding Joe, as we say it was Joe. He approached her, leant down and peered in and checked the car out thoroughly. Well, the original terminus wasn't exactly here, which some people tend to believe the tram pulled up here, but it actually pulled up just before the intersection of Webster Road over there, outside those shops. Now, Joe being here, he was on the dark side of the road, supposedly, as he describes, he's waiting for people. Why wouldn't he be on the lighter side of the road, where the chemist was open? He stayed on that dark side of the road. The tram actually pulled up a few metres short of the intersection of that where those lights are. That's where the real terminus was. Betty would have alighted from the tram just after the intersection here, walked that way and proceeded to a home in that direction, down the hill. Betty's house was in clear view from this end of the street, right to Montpelier Street, where that car just crossed in the distance.
Well, there were a number of witnesses who reported seeing a man hiding in the shadows near tram stop at the Grange, under a stairwell on the corner of Thomas Street. Now, Ken describes the area and his father's actions on that night. Let's listen.
This is where Joe, the witnesses saw Joe just here. But surely, if he led them to believe he was waiting for a couple, he'll wait for another, that was the term he used. He would have been on the lit up side of the road. He wouldn't be over here in the dark trying to intercept whoever made this fictional story told. Yeah, he was over here on the dark side of the road. And it was a perfect place to have a clear view of Jack's house. About 3 houses from that corner there. He'd have been surveying Jack's house in this vivid imagination about affairs and adultery and all that type of thing. He had been fixated on Jack's house to see what was going to happen.
And point out Jack's house.
It's about the third one from the corner.
Okay.
It's not the original house Jack burnt. I truly believe Joe burnt the house down in early 1953. I have evidence of that.
And just to remind everybody, every once in a while maybe say, Joe, my father. Because
I've never called him that in my life.
Oh, okay. So
no, I can call him my father, but I never mouthed the word dad in regard to him. Never once. It just did not occur to me. It came, to put it bluntly, he called me the bastard son of his whore wife. That's what he referred to me as a kid.
Did he believe that you were his child?
Like, subconsciously he would have, but in his conscious mind, his thought processes. I was born in Rockhampton. He worked at a bottle yard in Rockhampton with one of his mates. He used to go out on the road for days on end and leave my mother in the house with his mate and his wife. When my mother became pregnant, it was his idea, his thought processes, that she was having an affair with Laurie Skinner. And he said to me all my life, Skinner's your father, Skinner's your father. And I was a replica, and despite that, he claimed Skinner was my father. And he tormented me and my mother, and in public he'd say, Skinner's your father. That's what developed the hatred. The tram could have stopped anywhere, but it wouldn't have stopped at the intersection. It would have stopped. See where that skin clinic is over there? The trams usually stop there.
Okay.
The line went almost right to that intersection there. It was a single line. And on the Sunday morning, when the story broke in the newspapers, he was aware of my mother and my sister reading the newspaper, and he put on this great theatrical performance saying the tram stopped where the 2 lines became one. That's where the 2 lines, and he tried to impress in a very theatrical manner.
And that would have been down the hill and up to the crest of the other hill where the 2 lines were.
Yeah, those trees have grown, but in those days you could see directly to where the 2 lines became one. You could see directly to that spot. And Joe known the area well. He'd done everything to impress upon us. She did not get off the tram near Jack's place. That's what he was trying to enforce. She did not get off.
So she would have got off the tram here near the intersection, crossed over the street.
Crossed over, went past here, And Joe was either under the steps or slinking back in the shadows there.
And this, in 1952,
Yeah.
was a wooden staircase down.
There was a wood, and I cannot say he was under the staircase, but knowing his behaviour, he might have seen the tram coming, and possibly somebody could have got off the tram and recognised, could have been one of Jack's relatives or family. They may have recognised him. So, thinking the process, which I'd study the processes of his mind.
Rodardo's digging out of the area
there. Yeah, I believe his modus operandi type thing, because I'd studied him so much. He may have gone under that staircase when he saw the tram coming.
Unaware that she was being watched, Betty walked along Thomas Street, which makes a dip down to a lower elevation before rising again near Betty's home. Ken and I walked the same route, and we talked about the case. Ken provided more detail as we got out, and I wanted to kind of vicariously smell the smells and see the neighborhood and hear what was going on in the night and in the daytime. Now, Betty would have exited the train and walked right by Ken's father, who was lurking in the shadows underneath the wooden porch area. Now, I want to pause long enough for you to look at this photograph of Betty. Now, before I show this photo of Betty, I want to go back to the map we were looking at, because there were quite a few of you asking questions about what it looked like, what time of day it was. So again, to just kind of put things back in perspective with what Ken's saying, we're standing on this street corner right now in the interview. The tram would have stopped right in here in this area. And Jack, the man that Ken's father believed was having an affair with Ken's mother, lived in this home right here. And we're going to go down and look at that home in just a minute. But now we're starting to look down the street where Betty walked. And if we were to look at the end of this street, that's where Betty's house was, at the very end of the street. But right here, where this little red point is the place where Betty was murdered. And I thought it might help you to see what that would have looked like at that time of night. So I've gone back to September 19th, 1952, looking at the direct location of the sun. We're going to assimilate the sun going down. And at 9 o'clock at night, it is just about like this looking around. So it's still kind of light, but obviously getting a little darker. I don't know if that's helpful, but I hope it is. From the time she was murdered. As you're looking at that, I want you to compare it now against this photo of Ken's mother. This is a photo that Ken's given me permission to show. Look how similar these two look to each other. Now, Ken's father was under the false impression that his mother was having an affair with a man named Jack, who incidentally lived next to the tram terminal. Ken refuses to call his father by any name like father or dad. He will only refer to him as Joe. So you're going to hear him say Joe over and again. But he said Joe had a horribly abusive temper. And Ken witnessed his father beat his mother nearly senseless on many occasions. Ken told me the number of times he and his sisters witnessed their mother being brutally beaten were too numerous to count. He said that when Joe wasn't beating his wife or his children, he was committing sadistic acts against animals in the area, including family pets. And you're going to hear Ken talk about one of those times and how it impacted him personally. But what's clear to Ken was that his father thought that his mother was having an affair. And Ken thinks his father, Joe, mistook Betty Shanks for his mother. Now, Joe's intended murder victim was supposed to be Ken's own mother. Again, with Ken's permission, I'm showing you that photograph of Ken's mother over here on the left and Betty Shanks on the right. And keep in mind, in Ken's mind, that night was a perfect storm, as Joe saw Betty in the same area as Jack's residence, assuming that it was his wife who was cheating on him. Now, it was okay for Joe to cheat, but not his wife. Now, he watched Betty walk past him in the shadows, and when she turned down Thomas Street, in his drunken state, Joe followed and then murdered Betty. Let's listen to Ken's description of Jack and that area, and pay close attention to the end of his comments when he tells how his father tried to kill Jack by burning his home to the ground.
But Jack's house was a little old Queenslander with pull-up blinds. My mother had pointed out one particular day, while we're driving around this corner, it agitated Jo to some extent that she's pointing out Jack's house to me. And that was the angle.
And why would she point to his house?
Well, this was before the murder.
Sure.
It was just a simple statement, I think she's made. That's where Jack, she knew I was receiving some attention from Jack. Jack sort of was the type of bloke would recognise I had problems, and he was giving me some attention. She said, that's where Jack lives, pointing at that angle. When I came back, there's the house was, I'd recognised those days wasn't there. But when I spoke to Jack's wife all those years later, she said the house burnt down in early 1953. And I actually questioned Jack Joe, in some regard. Jack's wife's name was Hazel, and Hazel gave me this information about the house. She was traumatised by the house burning down in 53. So what I used to play on Joe's paranoia, and I got him in a conversation about arson. He'd committed other arson offences. And he said, I said, Joe, Joe, how would you burn a house down? He said, you get a big block of wood, you wire cloth around it, you fill it with diesel, and you just leave it there. It's like a slow burning wick, you get away. And that's exactly what he'd done to Jack's house. It is incredible, but that is the actual site where Jack's house used to be. And
Ken shared the following memory from his childhood, and I want to repeat it. He said, quote, when I was 8 years of age, I remember a night when Joe, remember that's his father, returned to our home after a drinking binge. To Joe's horror, he discovered my mother and me in his bed. You see, Ken had had a hard time sleeping that night, so his mom let him climb into bed with her. Ken says his father, Joe, drug his mother out of the bed from her hair, punched her, threw her to the floor, and began kicking her. He said that was the most violent assault I had seen my mother receive. Several days after that incident, he said Joe appeared as Ken was walking past his bedroom door, and he grabbed Ken and drug him into his room and threw him on the bed and held a pillow over his face for what seemed like minutes. Ken remembers passing out, thinking he was going to die. He said his older sister came to the door and screamed, and his father let him go. Ken says he staggered and crawled to find his mother, but she was so terrified of his father that she kept her back to him and didn't show the slightest sign of emotion, because if she did, she would have been beaten as well. You see, Ken said to respond emotionally to Joe's behavior was equivalent to pouring fuel on a fire. He said by age 10, he had developed a partially successful defense mechanism in regard to Joe's brutality. He said, I could anticipate what might ignite his fury. And he remembered on one occasion he saw his mother brutally beaten just because she made eye contact with another man. In hindsight, it was almost as if Ken could read Joe's mind. In fact, Ken says he never lost the ability to do that. A year later, when Ken was 11 years old, he remembered when Joe drove him to the home where Betty was murdered. He said his father threatened him and abused him verbally for some time, commenting that he'd kill him, just like he did Betty Shanks. Well, after delivering that message, his father drove him back to their home. Several years later, Ken and his wife were unknowingly driving through the same neighborhood where Betty was killed. And as he passed 32 Carberry Street, the place where Betty was killed, Ken had this flashback to the night when his father took him to the crime scene and told him that he's going to kill him, just like he did Betty Shanks. Well, Ken's wife was in disbelief, and as they talked, Ken noticed a young blonde woman hanging clothing on the line in the yard. He stopped the vehicle, got out, and approached the woman in the backyard, asking if it was the home where Betty Shanks was killed. The woman was a little bit nervous and responded affirmatively, and then Ken had a traumatic physical and emotional response that caused him to run away. Let's listen.
As you start, so we understand what you're talking about.
There was a major incident which traumatized me, of course, I was an 11-year-old kid. This was after the murder. I was staying at Joe's mother's house. She had some time for me. I was the only male to pass on the Bartlett name, as it was. And she had and Joe got some satisfaction out of this. I'm getting appreciation from mother for having a male child to pass on the name. But I was staying at his mother's house, not believing Joe would come to pick me up by himself. When he did, it really disturbed me. I was not to be in a car alone with him. He had already made one murder attempt on me by that time. He gets me out into the car, and his mother came and she hugged me and she ignored him. It disturbed him. He became so agitated. I got in the car. He motored away from his mother's house in a very sedate manner. Once he got around the corner, he nearly ripped that car apart from Shorncliffe to this point here, the top of Webster Road. He went through every intersection, drove like a maniac, and he kept staring down at me how disturbed I was getting. And I was getting disturbed, but consciously I couldn't show disturbance. That inflamed him if he showed disturbance. He became inflamed. We got to here, and suddenly he turns left there. I thought, why aren't you going this way to your house? Then he turned right and he pulled up outside that school ground, down at the bottom of the hill. And he sat there for about 20 minutes. And whether he was fixated on the murder scene, but I pretended to look straight forward and couldn't show emotion because emotion inflamed him. It was right here where she left the tram. I drove my wife down the road and suddenly I stopped. I've been here before. My wife questioned, how would you know all those years ago that you were parked here? And I said, I remember everything. I saw a woman in the backyard hanging the washing. And I said, I've got to prove this to you. I'm not imagining this. This is the house. And I went and I said to that woman, is this the murder scene? Deliberately kept 20 yards away from her. I didn't want to disturb her. I thought I might frighten her. This is the murder scene. I'm talking to a stranger, talking to a woman. And she said, yeah, that's the murder scene right there. And I knew where it was. And then I started to believe this poor woman's going to get agitated. And I said, look, I was here with a certain gentleman not long after the murder. And I said, I'm sorry, I'll have to go. It was so disturbing. And I walked up to where I left the car and said to my wife, that is the murder scene. I was there before. He disturbed me that particular day when he was agitated with me and his mother.
Well, I hope you can see how emotional this walk down memory lane was for Ken. As we walked together down Thomas Street toward the place where Betty was killed, I could sense the stress increasing in Ken. The closer we got to the home, the more agitated Ken became, and soon we found ourselves standing outside the fence where Betty's body was discovered.
This is the road she came down. I think in Joe's mind, he think they're going to hook up in the school grounds over there. She would have initially, if she had heard some disturbance behind her, she may have crossed there.
Because there was lighting, right?
But in Joe's mind, if she had crossed the road, he'd think she was heading for the school ground to meet Jack, because Jack had a wife. The processes of his mind, that's how they worked. He always had a theory about my mother's infidelity, and that would have been one of them. Stop sign just past there. There was 2 bohemia trees there, and they trimmed them right back after the murder. Not that they had any association. That was totally, there was no structure in there at all. Where he parked, see, just past that walk sign there, that's where he parked with me. That particular day I was agitated about what his mother and I done to him. That's the spot where he parked. But once he was there, he calmed down. For some reason, he calmed right down after those 20 minutes. Slowly drove up to Montalia Street and back to his home. But up till the point that he got here, he was so theatrical about his agitation, a huge agitation, and the car was vibrating until he got to that point. And he was, I could pick, he was staring down at me all the time, all the way from Shorncliffe. He was looking down at me, see how upset. But when Joe saw agitation, it fueled the fire. The more agitated it's going to become, it fueled the fire to a greater degree. But somehow I'd learned as a kid not to fuel that fire. Don't show any agitation, because it really enhanced the situation to a great.
So, folks, I want to pause here for a moment. I'm going to bring Ken and his daughter Rennie in. We've had a little bit of a difficult time getting Ken the connection made, but I don't want to lose this opportunity. Ken, how are you?
Fine, thanks, Mike. It's good to hear from you.
Great. Now, if you can have Rennie move that camera back so we can see you, and then not move it around any. Perfect, right there. And I'll tell you what, people. I don't know if you're able to see the comments tonight, but people are so appreciative of your willingness to share your story, especially such a horrible story. And folks, I'm going to have Ken just tell you about that experience, because we're now, Ken, we're now at 32 Carberry, right where Betty was murdered. You just went through explaining how Joe took you to the scene and threatened you that he would kill you like he did Betty Shanks. And years later, with your wife, who I hear today is her birthday, so happy birthday to your sweet wife. And by the way, folks, Ken's wife passed away several years ago. Ken nursed her and took care of her until her final breath, and it's just a guy that I have grown to love over the years. But Ken, take a moment and share what that experience was like when you saw that woman hanging laundry in the backyard and you decided to walk back there.
Well, like until that stage, there was certainly no 100% proof in my mind. But once that location come up, that was total confirmation. I was 100% correct, and all the theories I'd had, all the evidence I'd witnessed, and it was very disturbing for me to be 100% convinced as I spoke to that woman, and she verified the scene. And I'm certain I must have been very emotional, living a lifetime of and seeing people suffer, and not only my own suffer, but the worst part of my life was seeing my mother suffer to such an extent. That final confirmation that I was 100% correct in the evidence I'd found, and it just totally verified things. And you can imagine how emotional that may have been for a person for that moment of 100% plus proof.
Well, and the thing that I was impressed with, of course, I got to watch your blood pressure rise. I got to watch the stress as we stood outside of that home, and I haven't even shared what happened after that. But I want you to retrace.
Yeah.
I want you to retrace the moments when you approached this woman in the backyard and how concerned she was, and then how all of a sudden you thought to yourself, what am I doing, and how must this appear?
Yeah. Well, that's something I had to thank you for, Mike. At least on 3 occasions, I went to the house intending to go to apologise to that lady because I may have disturbed her to quite an extent. And this was something I was explaining to you on the day. And And you sort of prompted me to go ahead and do it. Just go ahead and do it. And we did. And it was the most magic moments.
So I want you to stop right there, because I want to play what happened, and then we're going to bring you back on. So don't, even though you're not seeing me, or you'll see me, but know that I'm bringing you right back on. So let me just go into this for a minute.
Yeah, good. Like, for instance, if a mother would scream when she was getting beaten, that'd agitate him even more. So I had learned for somehow, for the grace of God, I suppose, I had learned not to agitate him in any degree.
Betty was murdered between 9:32 and 9:53 p.m. on 32 Carberry Street. And as we watch this video of the area, I want you to note that the crime scene's just across the street from where I'm standing at this deli. Today, a hedge surrounds the property line where the once old white wood rail fence stood. The police report says Betty was beaten so badly that her teeth were knocked out of her mouth and they were found meters from her lifeless body. Betty had also had shoe polish residue and bruising, presumably from a boot striking her head. Now listen as Ken describes how abusive his father was again, then how he describes where Betty was killed.
It seems so strange to me that I remember every sentence that Joe ever said to me. They were all detrimental sentences in regards to my character, things like that, and about he wasn't a father, things like that. Whenever he had me alone, he had to agitate me with this barbaric statements about what a worthless person I was. Then he referred to this other fellow in Rockhampton as my father. But those disturbing things, they're implanted in your mind. Even though I carry no baggage today, those memories are still there. It's quite incredible, even to me, that I remember all those sentences.
I would challenge that you still carry baggage, Ken, and you couldn't carry baggage.
Perhaps, but in the conscious world, the love of your kids and the respect you get from the kids, it swallows that up.
Yeah.
And I believe she came down, he may have been a certain amount of yards behind her. When she got to the darkest spot on the street, under the two bohemias trees that were there, the
about
darkest
where that yellow barricade is.
Yeah, well, there's one about there and one a bit further. And it would have been, to see that image of my mother, as you've seen the photos, that image would have totally ignited. It would have 100% lost it, as much as he'd ever lost it in his life before. That his wife was daring to have an affair. You know, and that's where he found the strength to do what he did. That psychotic strength to do what he did. He used to hurdle the fences. He was very athletic. And it appears as though he hurdled the fence with one. He had giant hands. It's so strange. He's not such a massive bloke, but he had giant hands. And this house has
been... It would have been a fence about this height.
The same height. That hedge wasn't there. The house used to... The end of the house was about here. See about where that pot plant was. That was where the body was found. Now, well, between there, between there and the fence, yeah. Just in there, the police officer Stuart, he lived in the house next door. He found the body the next morning. But as I say, the woman I was talking to was over at the clothesline. That I didn't put enough thought into it. I was agitated that I was going to disturb her, and she pointed out the exact spot.
Why did you point out where it was?
Well, I'd say, well, you can't see it there now, but I'd say it's midway between. We'll see where that.
About where the bark is.
Yeah, exactly there.
Yeah.
That's where it would have been.
So, folks, I'm going to pause here for a second because something really intriguing happened at this point. Of course, I've really come to love Ken, but I'm also an investigator, and I couldn't just trust him because he was a likable guy. And so after Ken, I don't know that I ever shared this with you, but after you released the story of seeing the woman in the backyard, part of the reason I was so forceful in making you go up to the door and talk was because it was a way in which I could validate whether you were telling the truth. And I hope you'll forgive me for that. And we're going to play this as we go forward. But I don't know if you have any comments about that before we go forward. Ken, can you hear me okay?
I just missed that. Mike, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. We're gonna play this next section. Well, folks, if you're joining us, we're talking about the 70-year-old murder case of Betty Shanks in Queensland, Australia. You can go back to season 2 of Mapping Evil with Mike King and get the full story on Betty's murder, including an overview of the possible suspects in the case. But for now, let's get back to the moment when Ken and I were standing outside the home where Betty Shanks was murdered. This is when things really get interesting. And think about this, folks. Do you remember Ken's story about talking to the woman who was hanging the laundry in the backyard of the home 20 years earlier? The home where Betty Shanks was killed? If you recall that, Ken stated he got so upset while talking to her that he had to walk away. Now, Ken knew that he also upset the woman by his comments that he had been at the home with the man who killed Betty Shanks. Imagine how she felt when he said that. As we stared at the home, I remarked, "Hey, Ken, it's time you pull the Band-Aid off on this one. You and I are going to go up to the door and we're going to see if the same woman still lives here. And if she does, you're going to apologize to her for upsetting her on that day." Well, I wish I had been recording Ken's face when I uttered those words, because it was a mix of horror and confusion. But my intent was actually twofold. If Ken's story was true, I wanted to give him an opportunity to get some closure on something that was obviously traumatic for the guy. But if he was making this story up, I felt like this was a way in which I could validate things and really get some clarity. Well, at first, Ken pushed back, saying he was too uncomfortable to go to the door, but I insisted. And together, we went to the back patio and we approached a man who was standing in the driveway. Now, I broke the ice and I turned the discussion over to Ken, who told the man about what had happened 20 years earlier. And the man immediately said, "So you're the guy. My wife still talks about the day when the mysterious man approached her, saying that he'd been to the house where Betty Shanks was killed, with the guy who killed her." Now, he concluded his rather direct statement by saying how disruptive the visit had been over his wife's life in the last 20 years. But then the man surprised us, and he said that he wanted us to wait long enough for him to go see if his wife would come out and talk to us. When Ann came out and met Ken, they both started crying. Watch what happened when I took this video, with their permission, I might add, of meeting.
Well, I'm Ann.
And Rick. Ann and Rick. And then the tram comes along, and Betty Shanks got off it. He had poor eyesight, same as mine. And as a pitch black night, and she's the image of her mother, as Michael confirmed. And it's ignited every rage, every lifetime rage in him. You know, he was rejected by his mother, and he had that those issues, mother rejection. Every woman's going to reject him. Yeah, it would have ignited every rage in him. She made her way down the street. He would have secretly followed until she got to those two bohemious bushes, the darkest spot on the street, and then everything ignited. He exploded. He was a very athletic man, and like he was 30. He was 38 at the time. But he was as fit as a mallee bull, and with those rages he'd done that damage that he did. He then went to Bancroft Park, cleaned the blood off him, and it proceeded from there. I'm so pleased about today. The number of times I've been past here should I approach that lady and explain that situation. And yeah. Biologically.
I knew you had to be here, that's why.
Could you wait a minute? I'll go and get my phone. It'll be okay. Have you seen a picture of Betty Shanks?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was hanging out the washing. This is before we did any renovation. So, you know, the clothesline, the typical, what's it called? Hills hoist.
Yeah.
Backyard, putting up the washing.
I remember the picture. You had shorter blondie hair then. Yeah.
And he just appeared from behind the washing. And I just froze.
I tried to stay a distance from you, you know. 20 yards.
You were very, there was nothing untoward, but you were in this state.
Yeah.
I wanted to check to see where Betty's body, was this the house where Betty was?
Yeah.
And I'm still holding the washing, I'm frozen.
Yeah.
And you were just trying to get some information from me, just for your own, I could tell.
Yeah.
And then you told me I was brought here the day after she was...
Well, it wasn't exactly that, a short period after. He terrorised me. His mother paid attention to me down at Shorncliffe, and this was the route to his house. And he terrorised me all the way from his mother's house to this point. He parked across the road and was concentrating on something that I didn't realise, but I kept looking at this house. That memory was so vivid. There was a wooden handrail on the fence those days where he hurdled the fence. And as I say, I got to a certain stage and it was too much for me that day. I thought, am I going to agitate this lady? So protective of women. Well, I never called him that, but I called him Joe. Yeah.
Okay. So I always wondered who the man was that brought you here. Now Yes, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I'm still frozen.
Yeah.
And once you knew that yes, this was it became overwhelming.
Yeah, it was.
I can't stay here, I have to go. And you just, I'm like this, and then it was like, whoo.
I disappeared into smoke. Yeah.
And I finally felt, what just happened then? Still frozen.
Yeah.
And I finally went, oh my God.
Yeah.
I came running out here.
Yeah.
And went looking for you.
Yeah.
So I thought, did I just have this?
There was two people ran from that scene, Joe and I.
Yes.
And it's actually funny because Anne, when I got home, she told me all about it.
Yeah.
And what she just said then was exactly the same way she put it to me.
Yeah. And
it was like, so when you started talking to me and you said, this is what happened this many years ago, and I said, I've just got to get Anne. So I sent Carla to
How many years has that been, Anne?
Well, was she little? How long would
it would have been possibly 15.
No, it has to be more than that.
It could have been 16, but at the least it may have been 15. I was still investigating the case. Yeah. You'd done the renovations after that. I noticed it. Now you've seen a picture of Betty Shanks, of course.
Yeah.
She wasn't no makeup or anything, perhaps, in those pictures. But look at the hairline.
Looks very similar.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
No wonder.
You can see the similarity, especially with, the street lighting here. Not that
and
good.
he had the same eyesight as me.
Yeah.
Terrible eyesight.
Wow. Oh, absolutely, like the smile, the way, the cheekbones.
Yeah. It was beautiful.
The hair was very fashionable at the time as well. So.
That's the same hairline.
Did Mum ever know?
She knew, but she never discussed it with me. She fainted across. The police came. They went and interviewed Jack, I suspect. They were pointed out where Jack was over at Newmarket. The police arrived on the Tuesday morning, it would have been. I saw the police in the yard. I got home from school that afternoon and got to the top of his stairs, and my mother fainted across my shoulders and we collapsed to the ground. The police have been here, She knew, but she was brought up in total poverty herself. Her mother was crippled, there were 7 kids. They used to hunt for food virtually. Her father died when she was 6. All she wanted was food on the table. She'd never disturbed, she'd never tell the police about his activities around there because she wanted food for her kids, you know. And
Well,
she even said that to me. Well, I've told Mike before, you cop a punch now and then, but there's food on the table. But those punches were more in line with what he'd done to Betty Shanks, but he'd pull up short of killing her. And I've seen him.
Well, Ann's husband, Rick, then walked us around to the backyard to the same location where Betty Shanks was murdered. Now, Ken had described the location perfectly. Well, after we left Rick and Ann, we drove to Betty's home just at the bottom of Thomas Street. So I'm going to stop there and bring Ken back in. And then, Ken, we're getting a lot of noise from your microphone. So if you can make sure you don't touch the phone, but could you just share what that experience was like for you to go and meet Ann and Rick? Ken, can you hear?
I can hear you.
It's very static.
Okay, why don't you just explain to everyone what the experience of meeting Ken and Rick was like for you, and then I'm going to have you say goodbye.
Like you several times, I've tried to describe. Can you hear me, Mike?
Yes, it's a little scratchy, so just stay in one position and let's see if that works.
Well, like several times I've tried to describe it to my daughter. It was just magic scenes, absolutely magic. But that all that verification was coming forward. Like the way Anne described my emotions, things like that. It was very magical for me because it's something that I would have liked some of my family members to witness the scenes that you and I saw that day, and it meant such a great deal. I mean, I've spoken about it in depth to family members ever since. But it was just absolutely magical, Mike, and I certainly appreciate that nudge you gave to go ahead and do it.
Well, it was not only necessary, it was an honor, and it certainly helped me to understand where you are. Ken, thank you so much. Rennie, I want you to turn the camera on you and just say hi to everybody, and then we're going to hang up. And please give Daniel my love. Can you hear that? There we go. There's Rennie.
Hi, how are you?
Hey, it's great to see you, and thanks for helping your dad get everything figured out. And we're going to go back and play the rest of the audio with him, which is much better. And we'll do this again sometime when we have a really good connection, because I think people are really enjoying seeing and hearing your dad.
Yeah, it's a very poor reception, unfortunately, but yeah.
Well, it's so wonderful to see you, and best to everyone. And then I'm going to drop you off, and we're going to go on with the rest of the program. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, Mike. Thanks.
Aren't they wonderful? And Ken is such a peach. Well, let's jump back into this thing. And folks, I told you this was going to be a marathon. I hope you're okay. I don't know that I've done a 2-hour show in 2 years. So, but there are some really important things coming up that you are not going to miss. And part of that is what could be considered by some to be a confession, and by me, an admission of Joe's responsibility in killing Betty. Just so I could get a sense of where she lived and see the area. In fact, it was an easy walk. The home was under repair, but this video is going to give you a good sense of the area and how close Betty's home was from the tram terminus.
From the stories we've been told, that the hedging wasn't here. The fence was only a timber rail chain wire fence of about 3 feet high, and all indications are, in the photos we've seen, is her body was actually positioned just inside the fence line here. We started putting hedges up.
I always believed this is the house, and it turns out that it is. You look from the Grange tram terminus straight up this road, and it's the first house you see that comes into sight. This is the house here. I've often relived her steps myself, the fear she must have had in regards to Joe's actions, you might put it. I've often relived the fears she must have had that night, and it's very disturbing in itself. Where Joe's house is now was on the route to Joe's mother's house. He'd always take us down there acting like the family man, trying to impress his mother. He always looked for attention any way he could from his mother because he was rejected as a child. But straight after the fire, Joe changed his route to his mother's house. He took a totally different roundabout route that did not bypass Jack's house. It became obvious to me he didn't want us to be aware that Jack's house had burnt down. He wanted Jack out of the area. Jack used to talk about fishing. He wanted to go to Redcliffe. So Joe fast-tracked it for him. He burnt his house down on one Sunday. I believe Jack was on the fishing trip on the Friday night, told Joe he was going to Somerset down with the family on the Sunday, which where he was. They come back and the house was burnt down. And Joe described to me to a T how he would burn a house down.
Well, after we left Betty's house, we drove to the park where Ken said that Joe had the taxi drop him off after he committed the murder. It was there that he cleaned himself up before walking back home. Well, we stepped into the shade of the bohemian trees there in the park, and Ken retraced much of what happened when he extracted that admission from Joe that he says was a confession of murder. Now note that I said admission, because I'm not comfortable calling it a confession, and I'm trying to give Joe the benefit of the doubt based on his age and Ken's recollections. But I think you're going to find it compelling, as did I.
All right, we're ready.
This was one of several parks in the area where Joe possibly could have gone. But that information I obtained from him, I played on his paranoia for all those years, because I always knew he was paranoid about the Betty Shanks murder. All the answers he had given me, being able to read his mind the way I did. And when I baited him about the police situation that day, and he admitted Bancroft Park, when I thought about it, this would have been the logical place he would have gone. This park was so open to traffic. It was a lover's lane type thing. I know he had a girlfriend just opposite in the street opposite here, and it all fitted like a glove, especially in relation to the gentleman that got in the taxi just up the road in full view of Jack's house, of Joe's house. In regard to what happened there, everything seemed to connect. When he said Bancroft Park that day, everything connected. It left the murder scene, come here to clean himself up, either went in a disoriented state, whatever he may have been in, how his thought processes were going, but he made his way down to not far from his own home. And whether somebody spotted him, or a neighbour spotted him, he jumped into a taxi, or he was deliberately trying to create false evidence that a bloodstained man left the scene away from his house. But where he left, the taxi driver described that he was so disorientated, he didn't seem to know what he wanted to do. He took the longest possible route to where he eventually left the taxi along Ashgrove Avenue, left into Waterworks Road and back up the top of this hill to the rear of us, and left the taxi at the Red Hill Post Office and headed, according to the taxi driver, on the Kelvin Grove side, he left this side. Well, it would have been a matter of him returning to his car, just, it's downhill all the way, 10-minute walk down the hill back to his car. That's what I believe had happened. It's everything, how it all panned out, everything fitted like a glove perfectly to the admittance I got out of him. The admittance
so let's talk about that, Dave.
I've said to you before, Mike, about what happened, that incident. He was always, I was only there in regards to my sister's request, but I thought while I was there, I will try my best to try and get a word of guilt out of him. as I say. And I played on his paranoia. I gave hints of the Betty Shanks thing and watched his reaction. His reaction was such a bizarre and theatrical manner every time something like Betty Shanks turned up. There was one incident, it was a nursing home, I drove my sister there, and a volunteer by the name of Betty appeared, and I deliberately yelled out, very audible to Joe, "Hello, Betty." He threw his hands in the air and screamed, "I do not know any Betty." He screamed it at the top of his voice. But there were many incidences down at his house when I was complying to my sister's wishes where I'd suggest something about Jack. Never heard of him, never heard of Jack the Carpenter, things like that. Never heard of him in this bizarre theatrical manner. And me being able to live in his mind since a very early age, every lie was exposed because I could read his mind so well. I knew when he was lying. It was as if it wasn't an admittance or a confession, as I might term it. Not on one occasion. Every single time I mentioned Jack or something involving Betty Shanks or the word Betty, he went on this very theatrical denials, very, very theatrical about it. And I had proof in my own mind because of that, but it wasn't courtroom proof. It was the proof in my mind that I could read him the way I used to from a very early age. And
so tell me about the day when he admitted that he killed Betty Shanks.
Well, it wasn't, as you said yourself, it wasn't a confession, but he come down from the front yard, and I used to clean his yard up and take a bit of rubbish away.
And he's an old man by now.
He's 94, or 93 he would have been at the time.
But his mind was clear?
Yeah, he was, like, he might not have been quite as sharp, but for a 93-year-old bloke, he was pretty full on. And what happened, he appeared from his front, I've done most of the bit of help I give him in the backyard. He appeared from his front yard, and in an agitated state. "Who are those jokers out the front?" And he talked in this gravelly, "Hello, jokers out the front." And my mind started ticking over because I knew his paranoia about police appearing there. My mother would never call the police because of how he would have reacted. And so things started ticking over in my mind. I said, "Hang on, Jay, you just wait here, I'll go around and sort it out for you." I went around the front, and I thought the possibility there may have been police, but I doubt it very much. They looked like real estate agents, the same suit and ties and everything they used to wear those days. And I saw them sort of half acknowledge them on their way. I sort of half acknowledged them, and my mind's, the cogs are still ticking over. How can I take advantage of this? And I went back in and said to him, "It's the police," in a very deadpan way. I said, "They're here about the Betty Shanks murder." And he just totally lost it. And I said, "Look, they know everything. They know it all. There's no good denying." And that on top of the paranoia I already had, it seemed to work. And I said, "Hang on, Joe, I've spoken. You're 93, you're not going too well. Not travelling too well, or they might have turned it." And they said if they fill in the blanks because of your age and restrictions in the case, they may very well forget it. They won't pursue it. And I started running through what I knew concerning them, everything I'd learnt, which was a vast amount, but there's a few things I didn't know. And what happened, I started going through it, the fellow at the corner, Eve Ansell, witnesses all around. And he was astounded that I knew these things. He was absolutely astounded. He thought the police must have told me. And then as I went through he wouldn't say yes to anything. He just mumbled agreement, mumbling. And then I said to him, I'd always had the idea he would have cleaned himself up in a park, and like knowing the way he thought. And I said, "Which park did you go to?" And he looked at me and said, "How the hell did you know this?" He didn't say those words. And he finally admitted Bancroft Park. and it all fell into place.
We then went to Ken's childhood home, just a few blocks from where Betty was killed. Now, rather than me describing things, let's just listen to Ken as he relives part of his childhood. In the background, you're going to see his home as it stands today. But Ken's daughter Renarda shared a link to a movie that was made many years ago where they used the family home as part of the storyline. You're going to see the actual back stairwell where Ken says Joe tried to kill him again. And you're going to see the inside of the home and what it looked like when Ken would have lived there as a child.
But this was an old gravel road, and it seemed like a very old area. The home them days was an old Queensland, they refer to it, and it's all open front, a lot smaller than what it is today. Jack the carpenter was so heavily involved in this situation. He was hired by Joe to do these alterations. He's there for a period of several months. Naturally enough, when he went to work and left the carpenter in the company of a mother, it was automatic they were having an affair. That in his mind, that's just automatic, and consequently he set that trap for her. But the memories of this place, the cruelty I witnessed to human beings and animals, the destruction to people's minds, the memories are so vivid, how he destroyed that family. He totally destroyed that family. My three sisters are really, the three of them in a terrible condition. One is in hospital now. If somebody's, like, for instance, he came home one night and was complaining about his food was cold. He'd been probably with his girlfriends or whatever. He'd come home late and he complained his food was cold. And my sister had the audacity to say, "You're lucky to get anything." And he brutally beat her, something on the same manner as he beat Betty Shanks. He always had cats and animals. I think the only reason he had them was something to be cruel to. He wasn't for the love of animals, it was something to be cruel to. And I said before about the incident that a lot of little kittens were born. We'd go down there and find them with their heads ripped off. Joe would always say the tomcat done it, but we always suspected Joe had done it. And I told you about the incidents down at the local creek here. He made me kill those cats because I was in fear of what he would have done to my mother if I hadn't. If I had, well, I was in his backyard. He appeared from under the house here with a sugar bag and a brick and a tie thing for the top of the bag. And he was obviously looking for me to torment me. He knew I loved animals. And he approached me, and you could virtually see the cog sticking over in his brain. He approached me. He said, "Put these cats in this bag and put the brick in, and you go down to the creek and drown them." And I've described this before, but I was always in fear that he'd belt my mother if I didn't do. If he was upset with me, he got upset with my mother, and she'd cop the belting. He mentally tortured me, he physically tortured my mother. And so I thought, I've got to do this, I've got to save my mother. And I'd done it. And I was thinking all the way to the creek, I'll let him go when I get down here, and then he won't know. But it was an open paddock behind the house, and I made my way down the creek. I turned around, he was 20 yards behind me, making sure I'd done it. That's just an example of some of the cruel things he'd done. But they were endless. And he dragged my mother from the bed while I was witnessing, still in the bed as an 8-year-old. While I was witnessing, he ripped hair from her head, he punched her to the ground and started kicking her. And you imagine how that would disturb a child. But my thoughts are with my mother. The pain she always used to go through. I used to stand on this street and pray that he wouldn't kill her next time. I'd stand on this very street and I'd pray. I wasn't religious or anything, but I'd pray. Is he going to kill her next time? Is he going to kill her next time? That was that mental torture I suffered. But my thoughts were more with my mother than they were with myself. I was terrified he'd kill my mother. He dragged me from the hallway into his bed, and he put the pillow on my head. I knew what he was doing. He was serious. He was gonna kill me. And this does get a bit disturbing. But he had the pillow on my head. But I was pretty lively little bloke, and I was trying to squirm and suck air out the corner of my mouth. It went on for minutes. Then my sister came to the door and screamed, and he thought he might have to pay for it perhaps, and he stopped. I was like a jelly. I was so far gone. But somehow I managed to crawl through his hallway to the kitchen where my mother was. She had her back to me at the stove. She would not turn around. And admit the problem that was there, what he had tried to do. If she had have turned around and weighed something into that, he would have beaten her relentlessly. She knew if I turned around and recognised what you just tried to do, she would have copped a terrible beating. That's an example of the many, many situations that occurred in that house. Yeah, well, I was in one of the back rooms. I was asleep. I was 17. My sister came screaming into the bedroom. He's trying to throw Mum down the stairs. Well, half awake, half asleep, I jumped out of the bed. My mother's hanging onto the hand railings, and he's trying to rip away from the hand railings to throw her down the stairs, what he used to do to the cats and everything. And I didn't hit him at all. I just released my mother in a, I was probably bigger than him at that time. I released my mother, and I put my mother back inside in a chair, and things will settle down. I've stopped him. It's the end of it. And I was standing on the top of those same back stairs a few minutes later. My sister's boyfriend came to the bottom of the stairs and threw his arms up in horror, and I thought, what is going on behind me? And I just moved a couple of inches, and the iron missed me square on, hit me on the ear, ripped hair out, tore the ear to an extent. And he was totally amazed that that didn't kill me. He thought he hit me square on. And then it was to my advantage in some degree. He thought he couldn't kill me. To hit somebody with an iron like that, and they survived it. I turned around, the first time I ever hit him in my life was that day. I did knock him out. I knocked him out. And he had some fear of me after that. He thought, I can't kill this bloke, so I've got to behave myself, But I used to sleep in this house a lot, and I slept in that house. We used to hide in that house when it was vacant from him. We used to hide over in the bushes over there when he was on his rampage. But these are examples of life in general is just like that. That was par for the course, the way we lived here, And my sisters, I do not believe they've recovered to any extent, and my mother did not recover from it either.
Well, the day was coming to a close, but I had one more important place that I wanted to visit. I wanted to visit Betty's grave.
It is, but I can't fully comprehend even my own thoughts in that regard. It's such a bitter experience to know what happened to her. She could be alive today. She'd be 92 if she was. And then I heard other details about what you were doing in Australia. And between Rennie and I, we contacted you, and I was so impressed that what your response was. I'm only a voice in another continent telling you something, but I seem to gather that you thought there's something in this, and I was so impressed with it. That's how it was to me. Well, it is such a massive story, I'd like mapping Evelio for 20 hours, I've said to you before, but you've got to be realistic. But what you have put in there is you're selected as much as you could put in, and I totally agree with what you selected. That's what I would have selected myself. But as you know, there is much, much more that you've got that people can be made aware of, which adds more confirmation to the story.
In some cases, children who grow up in abusive circumstances also become abusers. Ken openly admits that he struggled with alcohol during the early years of his marriage, but then something miraculous happened at the birth of his first child. As Ken held this newborn baby, he said something to his wife that I don't think she believed, and I don't think he thinks she believed it. but he spent a lifetime proving that it was true. After Ken talks about that, we're going to hear from his daughter Renarda and her husband Daniel as they reflect on Ken and his influence in their family.
All importantly, this poor woman here, as you can see, only age of 22 years of age. It's just good to have it lifted off the shoulders and a story actually being told, and to, you know, to try to put a stop to this as well.
Legendary.
Yeah, exactly. And this just means so much to my father and also us children. What Dad went through as a child and what he witnessed, and this story now out in the open. My father raised 6 children, and the way he's raised each and every one of us, he's just given us unconditional love, and it stopped there. It just stopped there. And my father's not an alcoholic or hits the pubs. He's just a caring person, and we love you, Dad. We love you.
So I want to stop there just long enough because I edited something out that I didn't mean to edit out. And that was the rest of the story. As Ken held that first little baby, he had been drinking, he'd been carousing, he'd been living a pretty rough life. And after holding that first baby in the hospital, he said to his wife, "I'm never going to have another drink of alcohol, and I'm going to be a good father." And he's never had a drink of alcohol in 50 years since then, and has raised a beautiful family. But let's hear also from his son-in-law.
About 33 years. I was 14 and now 49, so there you go. When I first met Ren as a teenager, we just fell in love, as you do when you're young and you're free and the world's your oyster, you know. And then you get to be involved as part of the family, and once you form part of the family, and you feel great that you're part of a family. And I've always been part of a big family myself, but there was a period in my life that wasn't so quite right, and I couldn't put my finger on it or make sense of it. And being part of Ren's family, once I got to know the so-called baggage and that part of history and the story there, it resonated with me that I could open up a lot more with Ken about my life, and Ken had a great understanding and compassion for me, which has allowed me at times, and I've told Ken this, that he's like a father to me in that regards, and I can understand a lot of situations he's been through, and why he takes certain courses and steps in life that he does, and why he does what he does. It all makes sense. And
if he ever breaks your heart, if he ever makes you blue, just remember I love you, and I'll be there before the next teardrop falls.
Well, as we prepared to leave the cemetery, I asked Ken what message he'd have for Betty Shanks if he could talk to her today. He then talked about the friendship we've created, and his thoughts about this all came kind of full circle for the guy.
That runs through your mind. What can I say? I can't give you any compensation or anything like that. I can only express the thoughts I've had about her over the years, reliving, tracing the horrible moments, and perhaps considering the better moments she had in her life with her mum. But more or less, you'd like to do a lot more, but you're not capable. You know, the damage she'd done, you cannot undo. That's the type of thing that goes through your head. And like, I've always had a massive compassion for women. Well, you can imagine witnessing Joe's behaviour to other women through those years, and what you went through that night as an innocent, totally innocent person in every regard, and to think that You had to be the one who was mistaken for his wife. You had to be that one.
There will never be justification for the murder of Betty Shanks, and I don't know who her killer was, but I believe we're much closer to the truth now than at any time in the last 70 years. I really believe Ken's story. I think it has value, and I think it needs to be followed up more closely. I really worry that law enforcement has lost valuable evidence over those 70 years, evidence that might have held some answers, particularly some DNA evidence, now having the son of a person believed to be responsible for that murder. Or in Dew's case, a daughter who had a father who she believes killed Betty Shanks. Now, Ken truly believes his father killed Betty Shanks, and much of his story is incredibly compelling. You know, I've been able to personally confirm multiple statements that Ken has made through independent sources. But like I said, death isn't always fair. And since death isn't necessarily fair, neither is burials. Listen as Ken drops this final, surprising story in this 70-year-old saga.
Well, the women that brought me down to find Betty's grave initially, quite a few years ago, while they were here, I asked them to look up, and they had a computer pad or something. They actually gave me photographs of Betty Shanks' grave. They printed them out. They were so supportive of me, whether they had a fascination for things like old crimes, like some women do. They were so fascinated, and I said, well, can you look up Joe? And she looked it up, and she wandered off down that particular direction, possibly about as far as that big tree there. What would we say, 40 metres, 50 metres at the most. And she searched around a while and she found it. And I had to literally sit down in disbelief that this poor woman's grave was in a stone's throw of Joe's grave. It was unbelievable to me.
Well, thanks for tuning in on this special Profiling Evil video on the Betty Shanks murder. Betty died over 70 years ago. I'm finding comfort in knowing that we've been able to spotlight her story and keep this thing alive, hoping that someday the killer will be brought to justice. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this case and who you think killed Betty Shanks. Tell me what you think about Ken and his revelation, my father killed Betty Shanks. Well, thanks for supporting Profiling Evil. I hope you're going to hit that like and subscribe button, and I hope you're giving us a thumbs up. And please consider sharing Profiling Evil with your friends. Now, folks, if you're somebody who would like to make a financial donation to Profiling Evil, you can do it in a number of ways. You can do it the YouTube way with super chats or other kinds of donations. You can join our channel memberships, or you can donate direct to us through PayPal. You can find those all by @Profiling Evil. And folks, if you're considering a channel membership, think about our Academy level. We recently dropped 16 new episodes that are only available to Academy members. Now, for the rest of you, they'll be made available to you in about May or June, so just hang in there. And from all of us at Profiling Evil, thanks so much for your support, and we'll see you all soon at the next crime scene.